The following is a special video presentation of the Hennepin County Library.
Hi, welcome to a discussion with Anita Shreve. I'm Eileen Cavanaugh from the Hennepin County Library Program Office, and my guest today is the author of Where or When. Welcome, Anita.
Thank you.
Glad to have you with us. Anita is the author also of Strange Fits of Passion, Eden Close, and now her most recent novel, Where or When. In addition, she has written 2 books of nonfiction, Women Together, Women Alone, and Remaking Motherhood. It's relatively unusual for an author to write both fiction and nonfiction. How did that happen with you?
Well, I started writing fiction some time ago in the form of short stories in the mid-70s, and realized, as I think many people who write short stories, that I couldn't make a living doing that, so I turned to journalism. And I worked for a number of magazines in New York and then began freelancing. And some of the articles that I wrote, in particular the ones for the New York Times, sort of segued into books. And I began writing nonfiction books. But always, my first love was fiction. And my goal was to get myself to a position where I could then attempt my first novel, which I did in 1989. And since then, I've really almost exclusively written fiction. I have not yet returned to nonfiction, although I think I probably will at some point.
So you considered nonfiction as a good vehicle for moving into the fiction category?
Well, it was a way of making a living. It was a way of honing my skills as a writer. You know, things happen serendipitously. I didn't really plan it this way. It just sort of worked out. But I did have this great urge to write a novel. I think it was probably turning 40 that did it, because it was, as I said to myself, it's now or never. And you know, I sat down. Actually, I wrote most of my first novel, Eden Close, in secret. I didn't tell anybody I was doing it, just in case it was a complete and total failure. And then I found that I think that my true voice is in fiction. I have always thought, interestingly enough, that one can tell the truth much more easily in fiction, at least I can, than in nonfiction.
So you see fiction as a better vehicle for telling your truths, in a sense?
Certain emotional truths, yes. I mean, in nonfiction, of course, you're hampered by the facts of a given situation, or the agenda of the particular magazine that you're writing for, or you're limited by the scope of the story that you're reporting. Whereas in fiction, you know, while in essence it is a work entirely of the imagination, you're able to excavate more deeply into truths of the human heart.
And you can use some of the issues and opinions maybe that you found important in nonfiction and put them in a different context and a different meaning in fiction too.
Yes, I think that's true.
Besides this urge to write fiction, did you have background in training that matched?
In fiction?
Mm-hmm. Or in writing in general, did you?
I never went to a writer's school. I studied English and writing in college. I went to Tufts, and then when I graduated from Tufts, I was an English teacher in high school. I really, journalism has a way of, you know, you sort of learn on the spot when you write for a magazine. You learn how they like to have it done. And actually, I really started writing for a living in Africa. I went to Africa from 1975 to 78 and was deputy editor of a magazine there, a local magazine. And it was a 2-man operation, me being one of the other men. And I learned everything there. It was a absolutely wonderful training ground, because the fellow I worked for was really desperate and gave me all sorts of responsibility. So that turned out to be almost my equivalent of journalism school or graduate school.
How did you happen to choose Africa, or did it choose you?
No, I went over there really just my husband was going over there to do his graduate work, and I went over to accompany him, and this position came along, and it was really, it was being in the right place at the right time.
True serendipity.
Right.
Yes.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about Where or When. It's taken from the title of the song, the Rodgers and Hart song.
Yes. Two lovers, middle-aged lovers, 45 years old. The essential story is that two lovers are reunited after an absence of 31 years. Charles Callahan and Sean Richards were sweethearts, actually somewhat more than sweethearts. They were really adolescent lovers in a sense, at a Catholic summer camp for 1 week when they were 13. And they had a very intense relationship for that week, which the book dovetails in and out of the past and the present, and you see that relationship. But being 13 years old and having no vehicle and being separated, they actually came from different states. They were not in a position to continue that relationship, except in a correspondence which eventually dwindled out because it was very hard to sustain it over a period of time. Their families essentially took them apart from each other. And 31 years later, Charles Callahan, who's now in Rhode Island, he's an insurance agent and a real estate broker, and he has a wife and 3 children. He happens upon a photograph in a newspaper of a woman named Sean Richards, and it's not just the name alone that makes him think that this is this old love of his, but there's something in the expression in the eyes, even though when he last saw her she was a child. And she's a poet, and she's living on a farm with her husband in northeastern Pennsylvania, and the recession is also an important backdrop to this, because he is in a situation, his business is dependent upon local economy and the national economy, and he is probably about to lose his office and have his house foreclosed on as well, because his client base has really dwindled. But even so, in the brink of financial ruin, he becomes obsessed with this photograph and with thoughts of her, which he thinks in some ways he's been thinking about her all along as sort of a subterranean current. And even though he has a wife and 3 children and a business that's about to face ruination, he writes to her. He decides that he will write to her, and in taking that step and making that gesture, he really commits himself to a course that neither one of them can predict what's going to happen. They correspond, she somewhat tentatively at first, and in the correspondence they grow to know each other. They grow to know certain things about each other, not just about what is said in the letters, but what is not said between the lines. And eventually they meet, and when they meet, they become rather passionate lovers, and they are the novel really is about the strange and odd mixture of time and eros, and what is this love affair about? Is it the true love of a lifetime and they have finally found each other, or is it a way to enliven the torpor of their own lives, or is it a sort of a joyous secular sacrament of 2 middle-aged people? And really it's an exploration of the moral dilemma that they now find themselves in. Both are lapsed Catholics, but they both believe in their own way in sin and redemption, and they're faced with agonizing choices.
And actually 30 years ago puts their camp experience in about the 60s, when the Catholic Church was still a very conservative institution, and I imagine it was a very shocking idea that adolescents would have a sexual experience in a Catholic summer camp.
Yes,
back
very. And the title of the book comes from the song, the Rodgers and Hart song, as you say, but it was recorded by Dion and the Belmonts and was the hit song the summer of 1960. And as he is writing to her for the first time, various threads of this song come back to him, and he seeks it out, and it becomes, the lyrics are really, even though it was a pop song that teenagers sang, the lyrics are extraordinarily enigmatic. They refer to the line is, some things that happen for the first time seem to be happening again, and it forms the whole the theme,
almost a theme of their
of love lost, love regained.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. This book is certainly timely in that it reflects the recessionary period, especially in New England, where both of the people lived. I was wondering if I read it, as I read it, if you would have written this story differently had Charles' family been financially secure.
That's a good question. I didn't want it to be an isolated love story. I wanted it to have context. And I wanted, it heightens the moral dilemma. It makes it more difficult because if, it's not just abandoning his family emotionally, but he must think about how is he going to take care of them, if he plays this out to its final conclusion.
To say nothing of how he's going to take care of her, because
right.
her husband
is struggling on his farm.
Also,
right. In both families, they have been hard hit by the recession. Both have, and it just seemed important. The interesting thing is, when I was writing the book, which was now a year ago, because it takes that long for production to come out, I thought, well, probably by the time this book comes out, the recession will be over and people will be reading about something historical. But in New England, that's certainly not the case. I mean, some people are worse off than they were even a year ago. Right?
That is a concern, though, about writing a timely book of fiction, that the dating of that. However, it seems as if it is woven into the fabric of this story, so even a few years from now, one can probably easily remember back to those times. It seems as if there are lots of parallels. They're almost like twins who were separated and come back together and find so much of parallel in their lives. They're both suffering from the recession. They both seem to be suffering from boredom in their marriages. And it was interesting to me, as I was reading this book of fiction, to think about 3 recent books, nonfiction books, self-help type books that have come out, telling women in particular about how to get the boredom out of their marriages, how to light a fire under their spouse, so to speak. How does that issue relate to this particular story? Is boredom an individual's response to a marriage? Is it the marriage that's boring, the individual's response that's responsible?
Well, I'm not sure that I think that boredom is the issue. I think what both Sean and Charles seek is true partnership, and I think neither one of them has it in their respective marriages. And I don't think it was boredom. I think it was never there. Charles makes the point that while he loves his wife, he was never really in love with her, and that their essential differences have not allowed them the kind of intimacy that he was sort of, yearning for.
Still, he says that he now loves her more than he used to.
Because I think in the early stages of the marriage were really, as described in the book, were really fraught with his realization that he may have made a terrible mistake and the fear that he might have made a terrible mistake. It was really fraught with, battles and fights, which have now calmed down because they have children and they built a life together and they built a business together, and he respects her. He has a great deal of respect for his wife. Sean's marriage is quite different in that she seems to be married to a man who has intrinsically a melancholy man, and he's almost more wedded to the farm than he is to her. And the setting for the farm also is a metaphor for their lives. They're onion farmers on this particular geological accident of black dirt, and the black dirt becomes a metaphor, in a sense, for a kind of low-key despair that is kind of pervasive over their own household.
And she thought, when she first met him, that there was kind of dignity in his taciturn
Yes.
nature, and she was attracted to it to a certain extent. Charles, apparently we weren't so clear as to what Charles' attraction to his wife was, which sort of brings forth that issue of where's the responsibility once couples marry and decide what attracted them to a person is no longer what they, or perhaps never was, what they thought it was, and all of a sudden there are children and their responsibilities. Do you think society today is more tolerant of the idea that, well, it's okay than to go your own way and follow your heart and that sort of thing?
I think perhaps it's slightly more tolerant in that you don't get, you know, the sort of Victorian condemnation that families used to have. But I don't think, I still think it's agonizing. I think when children are involved and there's been a commitment to, you know, Charles and his wife have been married for 16 years and there's that kind of commitment, it really is agonizing.
And history. I mean, I sometimes think history is difficult to break too, whether it's on the one hand you might want to break it for something better, but on the other hand it's that history and continuance that's difficult for people to deal with. I thought there was an interesting scene when Sean is having the celebration party for her new book of poetry, and her husband Stephen sets his glass of champagne down on her poetry and leaves a ring on the new book of poetry. And then it's contrasted with Charles, who goes out and eagerly buys. In fact, he buys 2 books of her poetry and reads them cover to cover, and you see this kind of stark contrast between the two of them. Both of them, the other parallel is that both of them are disillusioned with the church. They met in a church context, and I think I'm correct in thinking that both of them sort of became non-practicing Catholics during their married life, and then reconnect again at the site of the old church camp, which is now a resort.
And I think even though they're both lapsed Catholics, he actually went to seminary after college, and he confesses it was a way to avoid the draft at the time. And although he says he may have received his best education there, she very nearly escaped entering religious orders by joining the Peace Corps, which is a kind of secular convent of sorts. Even though both are lapsed Catholics, they do share a very kind of profound sense of, again, sin and redemption, I would say, and their talk is sprinkled with words that we associate with Catholicism, you know, Christianity, such as epiphany. And she says at one point, "I am in disgrace now, removed from a state of grace." You know, she has a sense of herself as having fallen. As
and
a
he
result
kind
of
of counters with, does he say, "Not everyone is saved, but no one is lost"?
Yes, that's from the epigraph by Merleau-Ponty, where he said, "No one is saved and no one is totally lost," which is very comforting in his situation.
It seems as if there's maybe, well, I should ask you if there is a parallel between the fact that the church has lost meaning in their lives, perhaps maybe parallel to the same way their marriage has lost meaning in their lives.
Well, in a sense, yes, because what they seem each to be yearning for is a kind of connection, as I said before, a true partnership, and they seem to find it in each other. They seem to find in each other what, you know, that as she refers to early, you know, what did I know then of indelible connections? And it's this indelible connection with him that becomes almost spiritual in nature. The camp that they go back to, you know, I would just might add, is now been, it was an old estate, and it was situated next to a lake, and at the lake there was a cross, and they had outdoor chapels. Now the camp has been transformed into an inn, which is where they meet the first time for lunch, and then they go down to the lake, and the cross, of course, is no longer there, but the benches are there for the guest to sit and ponder the lake. And it's while they are pondering the lake, thinking about the fact that they're the same and yet not, you know, in the same way that the lake is the same and yet not, and the trees are the same and yet not, and it's that mystery of time lost, time squandered, the urgency of time, that becomes sort of at the center of the mystery that draws them together.
And the time is the same and yet different. The 60s were sort of a growing time. The 90s were a recessionary time. And even the bench seems to parallel that, because as I recall, there's a Gorgon's head on one side of the bench, and there's a positive figure that I've forgotten on the other side.
It's sort of a Madonna-like figure, but not a Madonna carrying a rose.
So right. there are those two opposites, on which sort of seem to reflect the opposites in their lives. Does this? Am I reaching too far? Does the novel say anything about the fact that maybe there are some alternatives to traditional marriage that are fitting people better today than traditional marriage?
I'm not sure about that. I don't think that they would have. I think what Sean and Charles really wanted was to have stayed together. I think they themselves would have made a traditional marriage. One of the things that's very painful about having met at 45, and Charles jokes, you know, could have been worse, we might have met at 65 and not 45, but even so, there is a line in which she's reflecting, and, you know, she says, you know, the summer that I met you, in essence, I became a woman, and the winter that I met you again, her womanhood, in essence, is over, in terms of her being able to give birth. And I think that's very painful for them, because that's what they lost. They can't ever retrieve that. They think of themselves as mates. They use that word as mates, but they cannot mate. And they can only be soulmates. And so I think, you know, had they been able to stay together, they probably would have chosen the traditional marriage, but they would have been together.
And she indeed lost a child.
Yes, in an accident.
Right. That sort of added to the sadness that he saw in her poetry.
Right.
There seems to be a very high price for infidelity.
Yes. There is an extremely high price. I'm sort of loath to give away the end of the novel, but I guess my philosophy really, and I don't think that this really is a price for infidelity. My feeling is that all lovers are doomed, and they're doomed by nature. They're doomed by time, and they're doomed by death. Inevitably, that's a given. And in essence, I think you feel this from the outset.
All lovers are star-crossed lovers.
Yeah, well, perhaps.
Charles and Sean seem to love each other equally, and to me that was one of the more appealing things about the novel, because it seems so apart from real life. In real life, it seems as if there's always an inequality, that one person loves more than the other. Yes, I think it was important that it be equal. I think it was important to show that she is, in terms of being the one for the other, that their intimacy be on an equal footing. I think it takes them by surprise too. I mean, I think they're both really astounded by it, that first lunch when they finally meet each other, and afraid of it as well. Certainly a sort of stunning revelation, maybe, after all those years. Yes. My theory, my own little pet theory, is that the popular music that was popular when we were sort of pre-teenagers, is the music that stays with us and affects us in our life, and calls forth memories. Was there something of this in your mind when you chose Where or When as the theme for and the title?
Yeah, definitely. At the end of the book, Charles sends Sean a tape in which there are a number of songs from that era. I think there are 3 from Dion and the Belmonts alone. People who were teenagers in 1960 will have no trouble recognizing them. A Teenager in Love, That's My Desire, Where or When, Come Softly to Me, Love Hurts, Crying by Roy Orbison. These are all songs that, they as they do for Sean, they conjure up images of, slow dancing in darkened gymnasiums and, in your teenage years. And I think they are very evocative. She actually says to Charles when she meets him for the first time, it was a kind of excavation. It was a digging into the past, but the evocation, it really reminds her, brings back all those feelings of those early years.
Barbra Streisand has optioned Where or When
Yes.
for a film, and has, as I understand it, has wanted to both direct and act in it.
Yes.
Which is pretty heady stuff.
Yes. I was thrilled when I heard it, particularly since when she tends to actually make the movies that she options when she really gets enthusiastic about them. And what's very interesting about that in this case is when I wrote the book, I did Where When has been recorded many, many times by all sorts of people, Ella Fitzgerald and Frank Sinatra and Harry Connick Jr. I did not know, however, that Barbra Streisand herself recorded this song in her 1972 Color Me Barbara album, and it was pointed out to me not only after I'd written the book, but after she had actually optioned it. And I have in the back of my mind this idea. I think one of the things that she may do is re-release the song, record it again.
I was wondering if perhaps the songs on the tape would be included in the movie.
Oh, I think it'd be wonderful if they were.
Wouldn't it be ideal?
Yes.
I mean, I can really see that as her kind of movie. Before we run out of time, I just wanted to mention one thing about the format of the book, which is very interesting. Novels are not known for their unusual formats, but this one is. The letters that Sean and Charles write to each other are in this format. And at the end of the book, the appendix contains the lyrics from Where or When. And the reverse side of the appendix contains the songs that are in the tape that Charles sends Sean as sort of a love letter, I guess, on tape, one might say. So this makes a wonderful gift book, as well as just a wonderful, suspenseful love story read. And thank you very much for being with us, Anita, and good luck in the future, and we'll look forward to Barbra Streisand in the film.
Thank you.
A presentation of the Hennepin County Library.